So, hello everyone. I'm Julia from JetOctopus, and today I'm really thrilled to start our series of webinars dedicated to JavaScript SEO performance. JS is really popular right now, and barely each website has JS. Other words, you guys are working with these JS SEO challenges. You definitely will have JS migration, already had migration to JS. You probably have different challenges connected with JS SEO performance. So our team has decided to open this series of webinars, and this year we will make a series of it. And I'm really thrilled to start with the webinar, which is named Migration to JS. And I'm really excited to have our speaker today with really deep and extensive experience in it. But first of all, I would like to say that if you like our webinar, please push like. We will be really thankful when you share that with your community. Please prepare all your questions after the presentation is finished. There will be the Q&A session, and our speaker will reply to all possible questions. So please put your questions even during the presentation. I will gather them and we will address them. So I'm really thrilled to welcome our speaker, Sofiia. This is the lady with 10 years of experience in SEO, with more than 5 years of experience in JavaScript SEO. She has successfully managed the site migration to JS with more than 60 million pages on a website. And she was at the very beginning of this process till the very end of it. And the success was really great because there was not SEO traffic drop, and there was even increase. So Sofiia will generously share all the best practices, all her experience today with you, how to make it, what is the best process, what are the best tools to organize all this process, and she will be very sharing today. And I really think and I really hope that you will be active today, putting all your questions, and I wish you a very good evening today. Thank you for your attention and for your activity. So Sofiia, welcome.
Thank you, Julia. I'm glad to see you all on this webinar. Today, we will talk about migration to JavaScript and how to do it easily. Of course, I will also talk about how to migrate your JS website with an organic traffic boost. Okay, move on. My name is Sofiia, and I have been in SEO for almost 10 years. For the last 5 years, I have been working in-house with a large e-commerce sites using JavaScript. So what I want to tell you is about my most interesting experience with JavaScript website. It is the largest marketplace in Ukraine. They used to call it the Ukrainian Amazon. In terms of traffic, it is one of the 5 most popular Ukrainian websites. Among them were Google and the social networks. And we migrated from the regular HTML to JavaScript. At that moment, we had over 60 million pages. And the main task was to not lose our organic traffic during migration. And do you have an idea about the result? We had a boost of 20% up. I am currently working with an e-commerce startup using JavaScript. A month ago, we had the first anniversary of the project. Unfortunately, the full-scale war in Ukraine was changed our plans of growth, but our first year was quite intensive for us. We started as a test website on a subdomain. The test was successful, of course, so we scaled and migrated from the subdomain to a new JavaScript front. On this slide, you can see our webinar agenda. JavaScript migration is an important topic because, in my opinion, most sites will soon migrate to JavaScript. This technology is fast, convenient, and saves your web server resources. JavaScript is evolving rapidly and has a lot of features. As I said before, I will talk about migration to JavaScript from my own experience. In the coming hour, I will share with you my best practices. To the first point of our webinar, the pros and cons of JavaScript. The most important thing, JavaScript is fast and user-friendly. The JS website is dynamic, it has rich functionality. And one more important thing is you can use microservices. It is very convenient. When you need to change something, you can change a small piece of code and the website will not break from that. As an SEO specialist, I really like it. For example, JavaScript is really good with changes in structured data. And to tell the truth, my personal advantage of JavaScript is scalability. With JavaScript, you can easily scale all the features of your website for many types of pages. This is a big plus for website architecture. And one more thing, new JS features are constantly being developed. I have in my collection one good meme about new JS frameworks and SEO. I want to share it with you. This meme describes my real experience with developers team. Let's go further to the disadvantages of JavaScript. At first, not all search engines can process JavaScript. And those search engines, Google, for example, that can process JavaScript need more time to render and index a page. Unfortunately, Googlebot doesn't support many modern JS frameworks. So when you will choose a JS framework for your website, ask if Google supports it and how long Googlebot will support update. Remember the story about Google and Angular. And this is a good moment to say that all frameworks are equally effective for SEO if you use server-side rendering or dynamic side rendering. And about the SSR, the main disadvantage of JS for me is the SSR. Unfortunately, without server-side rendering, it is harder to get fast positions in the SERP. It is very important to keep the SSR working and to check it every time after updates of your website and after releases. Because without working SSR, the site will drop down in the very short term. In my practice, we dropped from the first to the third position in the search results within 2 hours after server-side rendering failure. But despite these shortcomings, JavaScript is very useful for websites and for SEO in particular. This hem explains the difference between HTML and JavaScript very clearly. Don't you think so? Once you decided to migrate to JavaScript and have chosen a framework, you might want to know how to prepare a website for migration. This is what I'm going to talk about right now. I recommend starting with preparing a website for users because one of the main reasons you migrate to JavaScript is user-friendliness. We want to make our website more user-friendly and faster. We want to have more conversions. Therefore, the first step in the migration is usability and backend, of course. During the migration, we should always check the reaction of users. How shall we do it? The answer is A/B testing. After you have developed a working JavaScript version and checked the performance of the staging website, you should do A/B testing for users. I advise using Google Tag Manager or Google Optimize for split testing. There are other tools, as I know, but my best experience was with Google Tag Manager. And it is necessary to start A/B testing of your JavaScript website only with 1% of users. It is recommendation for large e-com websites. If you have a small site, you can start testing with 10% of visitors. During A/B testing, you need to measure the number of users, conversions, and bounce rates. Also, keep in mind to track of the number of users who added a product to the cart and visitors who added something to the cart but didn't make a purchase. If there are some problems with the cart or with the checkout, developers should fix them. At the moment when the conversion rate is the same or even higher on a new JS website, then you can increase the percent of users in the A/B test who can see and interact with the JavaScript version. And such A/B testing should be done on different pages, such as categories, product cards, cart, checkout, brands, and others. It may sound like a checkout page doesn't matter to SEO. However, without working payments and cart, we will not receive a purchase and money. SEO will not be efficient. And I want to mention one more important thing. At this point, Google and other search engines shouldn't see a new JS website, so we make a proxy for search engines. With the proxy, Google will scan the old HTML version. Here is an example of a data collection table. It is Google Sheets for data monitoring during A/B testing. I recommend using Google Apps Script. It is very useful for data tables. And here you can see the data we analyzed during split testing for users. Let's make a brief conclusion. During the split testing, you need to monitor the dynamics of various indicators on the old and on the new JavaScript website. And if these indicators are very different, you need to find the reason and fix the JavaScript website. Now let's move on to preparing your JS website for search engines. My main advice is to communicate with the developers team. I highly recommend you to create golden rules for developers with critical points for SEO. Check all releases of the JS website on the staging domain. There is a QR code. You can scan it and read the JetOctopus blog, the article about the crawling of staging subdomain. You definitely should agree with developers on the plan of migration. And one more thing, without you okay, they cannot transfer traffic for search engines to a JavaScript website. Also, my second advice is to make a list with all the functionality you use as SEO and to discuss this list with developers. All SEO features should work on the JavaScript front. What do I mean? For example, if you use the metadata module, you must be able to modify the metadata for the JavaScript website yourself after migration. If you have SEO texts on the pages, they must be displayed on the JavaScript site. And I have indicated 4 steps for making your website friendly for search engines. The first step is auditing of SEO features and services for a JavaScript website. Also, you need to create the list for developers. I talked about it before. The next step is implementation of your requirements. Then you need to test them all and to crawl a staging website. I'm sure you will find bugs to fix. After fixing the bugs, check and crawl the staging website again and again and again. The most important step is monitoring and collecting the data about your production website. And on the next slide, I will show you what kind of data we should collect to check the efficiency of our migration. You need to collect and analyze data from your production website as you prepare for JS migration. The bigger the website is, the more data you need. I had been collecting data for 4 months before the migration. I analyzed all URLs, position in SERPs, click, impressions, CTR. You can find this data in Google Search Console, and conversion rate and bounce rate from organic. Google Analytics will help you to check this data. Also, I collected amount of keywords for each page. I recommend daily monitoring of the main page and the pages with the highest level of conversions from organic. And for less important pages, weekly monitoring will be enough. And when you migrate to JavaScript, you will also need to monitor these indicators I show you on the slide and compare them. If your website will drop after migration, you need a rollback to the previous working version or make an urgent fix. And for global website, I recommend collecting data by countries. And here you can see the data I collected to analyze the efficiency of migration. It is data from Google Search Console and Google Analytics. I compared the data before and after migration. Of course, we have a lot of charts in Data Studio because Google Sheets can't process so many URLs. It is just for example. I also collected data about the behavior of search engines. I recommend monitoring the frequency of scanning, status codes, and most visited pages. Of course, it is a good idea to explore the cache of search engines and be sure to monitor Core Web Vitals metrics. After migration to JavaScript, your website may become slower due to client's rendering. And some information about scanning by Googlebot you can find in Google Search Console. And other information can be taken from the logs. We use JetOctopus to analyze the logs and Kibana to find the details. And if you have a large website, it means that you definitely have a tool for collecting logs. It can be Kibana, Datadog, Graylog, and so on. Ask your DevOps about it. You should compare this data before and after migration. As a result of an error on the JavaScript website, there will be non-typical behavior of robots. On the next slide, I want to show you how to analyze behavior of search engines with JetOctopus. I used JetOctopus log analyzer during our migration. First, I created a segment with a list of test URLs. This segment can be filtered in all these reports. And this chart shows the dynamic of the JS pages visited by Googlebot. And here you can select any search engine. Below are charts with dynamic of status codes and bot load time. agree that it will be very easy to notice the non-typical behavior of search engines with these charts. There are other logs report. I constantly use JetOctopus to analyze logs during our JavaScript migration, and I can recommend to use JetOctopus during your JavaScript migration. And on this slide, you can see a test pool of pages, not our real data. But I want to share one interesting slide about how the frequency of crawling was changed since JavaScript became available to Googlebot. This is a real log in this screenshot from JetOctopus. You can see how the frequency of visits to test pages has changed. It was only Googlebot. We started our test in the morning, 11 o'clock, yeah. And the scanning frequency immediately increased nearly 4 times. And a day after our JS test was started, the scanning frequency became as usual. I will talk later about why it is very important to monitor the frequency of scanning by search engines during JS migration. And I want to highlight that preparing for JavaScript migration takes a lot of time. The results depends on your preparation activity. And SEO specialists should be deeply involved in the preparation for migration. Let's move on to the next point of the plan, and I will tell you how to select URLs for testing your JS version for search robots. At this migration step, we have a working JS version which was tested on real users and with a high conversion rate. We also checked that all SEO requirements work on a new front. It's time to test a JS website for search engines. Go for selection of several pages from different types, product cards, categories and filters, articles, blog, and so on. It is necessary to divide all pages that bring organic traffic into several groups with the same type of URL. I recommend to select pages that are crawled by search engines on a constant basis and with dynamic change of content. At the same time, don't choose the most efficient pages in organic search, because if search engines don't like the pages you selected for the test, you will lose a lot of traffic. And here is an example of data tables. You can see a list of pages with positions, clicks, impressions, and the amount of keywords. Also, it is convenient to monitor data using Data Studio and charts. By the way, I had a website with millions of pages, but we opened only a few JavaScript pages to be tested for search engines. During the first iteration, we tested 10 product cards and only 5 categories with filtering. In total, there were about 1,000 URLs we opened to Googlebots in the first iteration of our JS testing. And one more important thing, do not open the whole website for search engines at one moment. Open only a few pages for testing and make sure that the search engines see only the JavaScript version to avoid cannibalization. A proxy will help you to do it correctly. And of course, you should monitor positions, clicks, impressions, CTR, amount of search queries, frequency of scanning by search robots, kind of a vitals metrics, status codes, and load time. Many of these metrics I talked before, CTR and clicks and impressions can be analyzed with JetOctopus. Here is an example of keywords report. The data comes from Google Search Console. Here is our search query and relevant URL, and here you can see your CTR and impressions and clicks and the difference between the periods. You can set up any columns you need. Next, I want to tell you how to check site availability for search engines. You started the test of your JavaScript version for search engines. And after the release, you should immediately check how search engines see the test pages. You can check how Googlebot sees your pages in Google Search Console, or you can use mobile-friendly test. Note that these tools show a rendered JavaScript. Make sure that Googlebot sees the JavaScript version, and make sure that there are in the code all meta tags, indexing rules, and so on. And also you need to check how your server-side rendering is working. You can do it with Postman or Chrome DevTools. Of course, with emulation of Googlebot user agent. I have made a list of elements to check both on JS and on SSR. First, check if this is really a JavaScript version, not your old version of the website. Next, check the title, metadata, hreflang, indexing rules, and canonicals. Also, check the availability of images. We often forget about it. And second, check the structured data and the internal linking in the code with a href. If you use text, they should be displayed on the page. And don't forget about the status code and the HTTP header. By the way, you can use JS crawling in JetOctopus. When setting up a crawl, select Googlebot user agent, desktop or mobile, and activate this checkbox, execute JavaScript. In the crawl results, you can see all the information about the JavaScript performance and compare the differences between your server-side rendering and rendered JS versions. I want to emphasize that comparing the code on the SSR version and the rendered code is very important, because the search engine first processes the SSR version and then renders the JavaScript. And for this reason, I recommend using SSR for websites in highly competitive niches. But before I will show you how to analyze JavaScript with JetOctopus, and after we will talk about testing the SSR on your website. Let's move on. It is the results of JS crawl in JetOctopus. Results contain data on performance, core vitals metrics, load time distribution, and there is a separate report with JavaScript errors. I also like the ability to compare the regular HTML and JavaScript version. Let's return to our points. And I want to show you how to check the SSR. I want to share with you my experience. I prefer to use Chrome DevTools or Postman. We will start with Postman. With it, you can send GET request. Pay attention to the type of request. With Googlebot user agent, you can change user agent here. Postman will return a page code without the execution of JavaScript. In fact, this code will be your SSR. And to check SSR using Chrome DevTools, disable the JavaScript in the command line. Use Ctrl-Shift-P to run a command line. It is really important to check that the SSR code contains all the necessary SEO directives and that they are correct. If the page should be open for indexing, but there should be an index follow meta robots both on SSR and JavaScript versions. And I want to highlight that this is normal when the SSR differs from the rendered JavaScript, but all the important SEO elements must be the same. Next, I want to tell you how to understand that the website is ready for full migration. First point. You have run A/B testing for users, and the conversion rate on the JavaScript front was higher than on the old one. Second point, you have checked that search engines render page correctly. Third point, you have checked that the pages with JavaScript do not decrease in positions in SERP, clicks, impressions, and so on. And they are scanned on a constant basis by bots. First point, you have a working SSR with important SEO elements like indexing rules, canonical, meta tags, etc. And they match the data that is available after rendering the JS. Fifth point, you have a working JS version with correct status code. Using JavaScript, it happens that the URL doesn't exist, but it returns to all response code. Sixth point, all SEO features are working on a new front. And if you change the metadata, for example, it will be displayed on a new front. Seventh point, your JS website has a high performance and core web vitals will not be a problem for you. And the last, you have checked that all URLs and all types of pages have a JavaScript version. In my experience, there was a case when some important pages didn't have a JavaScript version, so these pages returned a 404 code. Okay, to summarize all the above mentioned 8 points, for a successful JavaScript migration, you need to prepare SEO as soon as the development of JavaScript website begins. Don't put the SEO part until the last minute. Consider the SEO requirements when building a website architecture. Sometimes it is really hard to fulfill the SEO requirements on the first try. If all SEO requirements are met, congratulations, you are ready for full migration to JavaScript. And one of the best options is migration by subdomains. If you have different subdomains, you can use them to migrate smoothly to JavaScript. I recommend selecting the subdomain you are least sorry for and the subdomain that has low organic traffic. This is like an advanced test of the performance of your JS website on a smaller scale. And when I migrated my largest website JavaScript, I used a subdomain scan. I started with two smallest subdomains. Once all the bugs were fixed, we opened a larger subdomain for search engines. And only when we found a way to increase traffic for JS version, we opened the main domain that brought the most organic traffic. Briefly, you can start migration to JS with the smallest subdomain. And it is a good moment to fix all bugs on a live JS website. The second step will help you to get a traffic boost. For this, after migration of a larger subdomain, you should improve your JS version for search robots. And the last step is migration of the main subdomain with an organic boost. Okay, and now I'm gonna tell you about my experience of the worst practices during migration to JavaScript. And I want to ask you to share your most interesting SEO failures in the comments, okay? The worst thing I keep in mind is a release of the JavaScript website on a Friday night. DevOps and I checked proxies for search engines late at night. And after we checked this release, it had to be rolled back. So never agree to releases on a Friday night. And the second one was related to search engine scanning. When migrating to JavaScript, we didn't take into account the load on our web server from search engines. After we opened JavaScript promotional pages for Google, Googlebot overloaded our web server. And our promotional pages were inaccessible for visitors for 20 minutes. So you can imagine that this was a huge loss for such popular website. As a result, we blocked the path of URLs using robots.txt file. And one more important thing. I always recommend keeping in mind that search engines are very active in scanning the new version of your website. Usually the scanning frequency is doubled or tripled. And if search engines crawled your website very often before the migration, you can imagine how many visits there will be after the migration to JavaScript. That is because robots like to explore something new. And be sure to perform a load testing of your web server to find the crash point. But there is also good news. The problem with overloading is not relevant for small websites with a low scanning frequency. Our webinar is almost over. At the end, let me give just a few words about what to check after migration and how to do it. You have checked the conversion rate, checkout, and the payment method, and your website performs really fast. Everything is okay with SEO on the JavaScript website, and all pages have migrated to JS. It seems that the migration was successful. However, I advise you to go on monitoring and comparing the data you collected before and during the migration. Go on the data table with clicks, conversions, keywords, impressions, and so on. On this slide, I used the image you have already seen because you don't need to change the data for monitoring. Additionally, it is necessary to check on a constant basis whether the SSR works. The best way to do is to make automated tests for the SSR and for the client-side rendered part of the website. After each release, after each update, you need to check the SSR and whether the SEO directives work properly, both on the SSR and rendering JavaScript. Regularly check that the same data, for example, titles, meta descriptions, main content, meta robots, etc., is displayed on the SSR and the rendering JavaScript. Also, you can set up regular crawling in JetOctopus. To save limits, you can select multiple pages of each type and save the list as a separate segment. That is all I wanted to share with you today. Let's finalize. Successful migration to JavaScript is a really long process that requires strong preparation activity. I recommend preparing a list of SEO requirements in advance so that developers can take them into account when creating a site architecture. And in my opinion, A/B tests and data for analysis are never enough. That's why keep on doing them before you meet the great result. And I wish you really great results in migration your website to JavaScript. Thank you for your attention. Let's move on to your questions. Thank you.
So thank you, Sofiia, for a really interesting presentation. And we are waiting for the questions. Meanwhile, we have also one participant from the technical department, our CTO of JetOctopus, who is not so positive about JavaScript, and I will be willing to have him just for a couple of minutes and share his thoughts on it, so to make this discussion like both parties to participate. So please, Serge, welcome.
Hi there. If someone talking about JavaScript, I can be out. I should participate for sure. I have a question for you, Sofiia, about JavaScript migration. What do you think if you, at that moment when you migrate your website, and if you not implement at that moment SSR, will this migration will be successful or not without SSR?
Of course, I think I can migrate effectively to JavaScript without SSR, but
you told about yes. SSR. It's crucial.
Our largest website has very high positions in SERP, and we used regular HTML 10 years before migration. And Googlebot cached all these pages with HTML. That's why after we tested migration without SSR, and our position decreased because of our previous version of the website. But if you want to migrate without SSR, you should test how your website will work without SSR, and how Googlebot will index your pages.
Okay, thank you. That's why I'm asking, because from our clients, and as Julia said, I'm not so JavaScript fan because I see the technical implementation of JavaScript crawling, and I can understand what Google does on their own side. And what I saw from our clients that we saw a lot of migration to JS, and a website migrated to JavaScript, and like after, of course, it's not so successful. Very oftenly position drops, traffic drops, and right after half year, 1 year, like everybody remember about SSR and started to implement it with very huge server costs, very huge pain, because it was not implemented from the beginning of that. So just one more mention about importance of server-side rendering for JavaScript website, because with SSR, your website in terms of Googlebot behavior and Googlebot eyes, it will be a usual HTML website as it was before.
I want to say that it isn't necessary to duplicate everything using SSR.
But the main content.
Yes, the main content, the main SEO elements, indexing rules, hreflang, and all that Googlebot is using for indexation. Yeah. You don't need to create something special code which will duplicate your functionality of the JS website.
Yeah, thank you for the answers. I'm finished. Bye.
There are a couple of questions, Sophia. Makita is asking, is there any difference between the frameworks for migration?
There is no difference between frameworks. Usually, you can use Angular or React to migrate to JavaScript. They are equally good if you use the server-side rendering or dynamic rendering. Thank you for the question, Makita.
Okay. One more question is from Anatoly. Our website doesn't have subdomains. Can we go by folders? Any difference there?
One moment. Yes, you can use directories, and if you decide to migrate by directories, you can use the scheme with 4 steps. Migrate, for example, your subdirectory with French language, then migrate other language, and so on. But you should find the folder, the directory of your website with regular scanning of Google robots and with organic traffic. That's all.
Thank you, Sophia, for that. I guess there are no more questions up to now. So we do hope that it was very interesting for you, because it was interesting for us, because we do know this huge website, and we've been really close during this migration. It was a challenging process, but it was a very successful one. And we are really happy to have you, Sophia, tonight. And thank you very much for sharing all the practices and all the recommendations here. Thank you all for the attention. If you will have more questions, you can send them after, and we will address them as usually. I always repeat that you always have a 7 days free trial, and you can check your JS performance on your website with no cost, and to check all the possible tools at JetOctopus.com. So again, I want to repeat that this is just the first webinar in the series of webinar dedicated to JS. So please stay tuned, and you will get the recording of it. and you will definitely have the information about the following new webinars dedicated to JS. So thank you all for your time today. Sophia, thank you very much. It was very, very informative.
I was very happy to take part in the webinar, and thank you for the opportunity to share my experience. Thank you.
So thank you very much. You have a good evening, and see you the next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.